Good morning again, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time out of our busy days to join us. We are going to hear once again part 2 of John Lowe's series on mass production back in World War II. So we're very pleased to have him back with us to give us more insight into this truly amazing story of how us back here on the home front helped win a global conflict. John is one of us. He's a CAF SoCal volunteer. He's also a native of Camarillo, growing up hearing F-89s and F-101s scrambling out of Oxnard Air Force Base on Afterburner. Following college, he began a 42-year career in aerospace, starting with ABEX Aerospace over at Oxnard Airport. His first assignment was production of the electro-hydraulic servo valves for the F-16 flight control system. I knew them as ISAs, Integrated Servo Actuators. By the way, thank you. They worked really, really well. Okay, John then moved into manufacturing engineering, responsible for servo valve and hydraulic pump assembly and test planning, traveling globally to train customers on the assembly and testing of certain ABEX products. Following a tour in Michigan, he transferred back to Irvine, California with a new trajectory into aftermarket logistics. At the beginning of the F-22 Raptor program in 1999, he was involved in sparing analysis software for the F-22 fleet, then the F-35 fleet, and also legacy FA-18s for the Navy. The sound of aviation. Stick around. You can hear it on our ramp in a little bit. Okay, he then moved into customer support for Northrop Grumman down in El Segundo, where he led a team providing spare parts for FA-18s for the Navy and supported installation of parts software analysis for the RQ-4 Global Hawk fleet for the Air Force. Okay, after involvement in several programs that he can neither confirm nor deny, he retired in 2019. He started volunteering for us in 2010, where he's been involved in the care and feeding of many of our diverse aircraft around here. He's also served a tour on our wing staff. He is the volunteer's volunteer. He serves as the president of the Wings Over Camarillo organization, which plans and executes the local air show here in August every year. He is regularly volunteering at golf tournaments and other such events around the region, and he volunteers herding the cats at the massive annual air show in Oshkosh. Please welcome logistics expert John Lowe.
Thanks, Rob, and I'm really not like 105 years old the way that resume sounds. Well, welcome. As they say in the airline business, buckle your seatbelt, and we'll have a little fun here. Just to set the stage for today, in the 1930s, all of our airplane manufacturers in the United States, and really pretty much all over the world, were what we call job shops, which is a term that's still used today for any business, small business generally, that will make one or two or three of something for you. And at that, back in the 30s, all of the airplane companies were working that way. They only built a few airplanes. They didn't do mass production. None of them had moving assembly lines like the automobile companies did. You can see pictures from the 30s of automobile factories where the cars are rolling along. Remember, Henry Ford with the Model T pioneered the moving assembly line to build those cars. But as we come forward in time towards that faithful day of December 7th, our government knew that mobilization and expansion of manufacturing was going to be required because, yea, verily, war was already going on over in Europe. This time, what we're going to do is peel back the onion a little more, just looking at some of the factories rather than the aircraft themselves. I will, from time to time, mention ladies that we just call Rosies, and we mean that as a term of endearment. Whether they were welding ships up in Richmond, the Liberty ships that had a lot of women working as welders, or the women working on any of our assembly lines at the modification centers all over. A lot of women working, and we'll see some pictures of them. So we'll get started. So looking back at part one, for those of you who don't know, this pistol in the picture is a model 1911 .45 caliber Colt automatic pistol that our military used from 1911 until not very long ago when 9mm pistols became the preferred weapon. However, lots of people still like this pistol for what it does, and it's still used regularly in competitions. The reason we're showing this and with the word Singer under it is in 1939, our government, realizing what was going on, came up with this notion of doing educational orders. And these were contracts that they let out to firms like Singer. And now think about Singer sewing machines in 1939 or so. They had all metal parts in them. All the little gears and whatnot were all metal. So they knew how to machine intricate parts. So they gave Singer this contract to build 500 of these pistols in a month. Well, Singer built the 500 pistols, but it took them several months. So they never got the mass production contract, and it went to Remington Rand and Ithaca Firearms. But this was just indicative of one of the things going on at the time, was giving different companies like Singer these trials to see if they could then scale up. Did they have the capability, the intellectual know-how, the management to be able to scale up into something like making 500 of these Colts a month? And it didn't happen with them. Another thing that happened in this time frame was Britain was already going to war with Hurricanes and Spitfires with Rolls-Royce Merlin V12s in them. And they needed a lot of those. So the Brits came over here to the States and they talked to Henry Ford. Will you build us Merlins? And if you know history, back in those days, old man Henry was very, very much anti-war and didn't want to get involved at all. So he said no. So because of reputation, they went to Packard. And now remember, in this time, Packard was one of the big companies building cars and built great cars and had a great reputation. So the Brits talked to them, and Packard said, yeah, we'll do it. And so they tooled up for it. And by August of 1941, they were making Merlins, and they made a lot of them. The interesting thing is, they had to make them exactly the same as the British built engines. And if you know anything about them, all of the fastener screws, bolts, etc. were Whitworth. They weren't American, they weren't metric, they were Whitworth. So Packard had to, in fact, make all of those fasteners themselves in their factory to use. Other things like carburetors and such that they let contracts out to subcontractors, they still had to make those parts exactly the same as the British. So parts were all interchangeable, and you may know that Merlin's was what made the P-51 such a great airplane to be able to fly from England to downtown Berlin and back. So this was an important thing. Also, at this time, Rolls-Royce was still kind of doing a little bit of job shop stuff in building the engines. So Packard really led the way in facilitizing and having the parts made in a mass production way so they could build so many of them. One more from our first time around. This is the Chrysler tank factory in Detroit. They started building this in September of 1940, so before Pearl Harbor, and they started making first the M3 Grant tanks, which was what we went to in North Africa. And this right here is the last M3 Grant coming off of the line, and everything else here is the M4 Shermans, which did the bulk of our tank work in Europe, and well, Africa, and then certainly in Europe after Normandy when we were marching towards Berlin. They were actually starting to build these tanks before the factory was even complete, which happened a lot, building stuff outside while the factory is being built around you. So here we are. Now it's 1937. America's at peace. So what's going on? Well, this picture is Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica. And what's going on here? They're building one DC-4E model airplane for an airline. That was it, one. So truly, job shop. If you look there in the photo, you don't see any assembly line. You don't see anything moving. There's other work going on over in the background. But this was very much our airplane manufacturer's mentality at the time. Over in Great Britain, 1937, they're thinking ahead a little bit. While they're still doing kind of job shop here with these guys working on Merlins, the Brits incorporated a system they called shadow factories, where they stood up small little factories scattered around the countryside to make assemblies like engines and other airplane parts, even build airplanes, so that if a factory was bombed by the Germans, that didn't put them out of business. They still had all these other little places making parts. So this served them very well, and they conducted that way of doing business the entire time during World War II. So here we are back in the States, and the airplane in this picture is the Martin B-10, which came out in 1934. So it was not a World War II airplane, it was pre-war, but for whatever reason, I guess because it was the only real bomber the Air Corps at the time had, it became the yardstick to be used by the Army Air Corps planning section that was thinking ahead, how can we do large production, mass production, industrial scale things? And so they decided this was a good instrument to be used to do that planning. Well, what was their ideas? Convert an automobile factory to make airplanes. Okay. They went and talked to Packard, Graham Page, which is an old name now, and Hudson. Could they be converted to build a twin-engine bomber similar to the B-10, even though by 1938 the B-10 was obsolete? But the planners were more worried about the general problem. Can a twin engine bomber of, say, 10,000, 12,000 pounds be manufactured in automobile factories? Well, at first blush, you think, okay, yeah, that might work. That might work. So, in theory, sure. They actually took the airplane drawings and broke it down into components and decided, well, okay, let's get the car companies to look at this data, engineering data, drawings and such. And so they needed their help. But what they found was, well, in practice, theory and practice are two-way different things. So they went to these car companies with these drawings and report information from the Martin B-10 and found out that the car guys had no clue how to deal with this, how to take a set of drawings and manufacturing instructions for an airplane and figure out how to make that in their factories. They were car guys. They had no idea about making airplanes. And the War Department and the Air Corps didn't really have funding to try to give these guys money to do that. So with a production study from Martin, they talked more to the car companies, but the educational orders, which were available at the time, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, those were available, but they didn't want to use them. Our Air Corps planners didn't want to use them, and of course, the car companies didn't want to do anything without being paid. This was the Depression still. They didn't have money laying around just to do fun projects. So what they did figure out, though, was that between those three companies, Packard, Graham Page, and Hudson, combined, they had factory space of over 7,750,000 square feet. Sounds like a lot. But they would need another 500,000 square feet if they wanted to do something like a bomber. But here's the big rub. Car factory is built to build cars that are, this wide. How are you going to convert that into something like a bomber with a wingspan of 80 feet, 90 feet? That won't work. So the whole thing just ended up not going anywhere, and the planners kind of went back to their offices and filed all the reports, and that was it for the time being. So now we're into 1939. The president, FDR there, went in January and went to Congress and said, we need to build 3,000 airplanes. And everybody's like, how are we going to do that? Where's the money? We can't just make 3,000 airplanes out of thin air. Well, behind the scenes, Lewis Johnson, who was the acting Secretary of War, a name we're hearing again lately, and his subcommittee said, let's make it 10,000 airplanes. And the automakers were still being skeptical and everything. Congress began to debate the whole issue, and Congress ultimately passed a budget for 6,000 airplanes. And this meant that, yea, verily, the Air Corps went forward with planning to build 5,500 airplanes. Okay, so now it's 1940. Over in Europe, the war's on. Remember, Hitler invaded Poland September 1st, 1939. In the middle of 1940, you have the Battle of Britain going on. So FDR asked for 50,000 airplanes. And then in December of 1940, he took a trip on a U.S. Navy ship, came back, and sat down to do one of his famous fireside chats that he did at the time, where we all would sit around the big radio in our living room and listen to FDR. And this is when he first said, manufacturers of watches, of farm implements, of linotypes and cash registers, sewing machines and lawnmowers are making fuses and bombs and telescopes and shells and pistols and tanks. And this is when he said, we must be the great arsenal of democracy, which is a famous statement from back then that you still hear about today. So, good news, we now have everybody behind us to begin building stuff. So starting in 1940-ish and through 1941, Boeing started extending their Seattle plant. Remember, the main Boeing plant has always been up in Seattle. They wanted to assemble B-17s up there that the Army was buying from them. But they were asked to build a whole new factory in Wichita, Kansas, for an outlay of over $10 million at that time, which would be today a really big number. Glenn Martin, back in Maryland, that built the B-10, built the B-26 during the war, now is conglomerated with Lockheed as Lockheed Martin. They took on increasing their Middle River plant for $7 million. North American Aviation, that a lot of us are familiar with, they received a contract for $2.5 million to expand the Inglewood plant, which we'll show a picture of. And if you're not familiar with where North American Inglewood was, it's now part of LAX. And then at the same time, they agreed to build a brand new factory in a Kansas City suburb to build B-25s, which we'll talk about, and then a plant down in Dallas to build trainers, AT-6s and SNJs for the Navy, which we have 2 SNJs here at the wing, and P-51 fighters, all being built down there in a suburb of Dallas. So while that work is going on, yea, verily, there's this thing on December 7th that happened, and starting the next day on December 8th, the company awakes. It was the Japanese admiral who said, we have just awakened a sleeping bear, and that's exactly what happened. This is a picture of a map, kind of a facilities map across the country. There was a number of these done a little bit later. Of course, this wouldn't have been indicative right on December 8th. But you can see here in this where you see the blue blobs, that's where most of the manufacturing is going on. So up in the Northeast corridor there, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, across there, a lot of factories. Out on the left coast, you can see up in Seattle, manufacturing going up there. The blob around the San Francisco Bay Area is indicating the shipyards at Richmond that were building Liberty ships. And then, of course, finally, the blob down here in SoCal, representing all of the aircraft that were being built down here. So, and then interspersed across there, it shows where various Army camps, Marine bases, Navy bases are. So, what do we do now? Well, we've got to fight a war. We need capacity. So, 2 things came into play: greenfielding and GOCO. All right, greenfielding was not really a new thing, and greenfielding is just that you go into a place where it's just grass and dirt, and you put up a factory, a building, a housing development, whatever, but a place where nothing was before. The reason for doing greenfielding was where was all these factories on the left coast, like Inglewood, El Segundo, Downey, those places, San Diego, right on the coast where we were close enough to the water for the Japanese to attack, which in 1942 was a very real fear. So all of our planners decided we needed to put factories out in the heartland where they'd be safe from attack. So greenfielding really came into play. The other thing is GOCO. That's an abbreviation for government-owned, contractor-operated, which means the government pays to put up a facility and a contractor, say Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, operates it. This is still done today. The Lockheed Martin factory in Fort Worth, Texas, that's currently building F-35s, is actually Air Force Plant number 4, which we'll talk about later. So it's owned by the government, but operated by Lockheed Martin. Their name's out in front. It's all their people inside, but the ground it's on and the building is actually owned by the government. So a lot of GOCO work was done early on, and not just with the big airplane factories, but with a lot of the subcontractor places and especially munitions factories. We went in, greenfielded, stood up, built factories to make ammunition, to make shells and black powder and explosives and all of those things. We used talked about those in part 1, but all of those things happened were greenfielded out in the middle section of the country. So this is a picture of the Ford Willow Run B-24 factory just getting started. Now, out of all the airplane factories in World War II, Willow Run, Ford Willow Run, is the one that seems to have the most articles, books, etc. about it. But it was greenfielded there at Willow Run outside of Ypsilanti. But Henry Ford being the way he was, he paid for it. He built it, he paid for it, and then leased it to the government. So it was a reverse. It was like a co-go rather than a go-co. But ultimately, there were nearly 42,000 people working at that factory. That's a lot of folks. Because of that, and if you look out there across the field, you don't see houses, do you? There was no place for all these people to live that they needed to hire. So because of that, the Federal Public Housing Administration came in to build housing for the employees that Ford needed to source, to hire, to train, to employ in the factory. This is a picture of Willow Run Lodge, it was called. And it's basically dormitories, barracks, if you want to call it that. Not very fancy, but at least it was located right close to the factory. So the first thing they did that the Housing Administration did was built Willow Run Lodge, and then next they did Willow Run Village. And now, if you look at that doesn't seem very homey at all, does it? It kind of looks like cargo containers with a bedroom attached to the side, although cargo containers hadn't quite been invented yet. But if you look out in the background at the top of the photo, you can see the barracks buildings back there. And being in the early 1940s, Park Ridge homes were also built for the African American employees to live in. There was still a bit of segregation, at least as far as housing. In the factories, everybody was pretty much equal, but housing still took that. These Park Ridge homes survived until about 30 years ago, and then were torn down and new replacement homes put up in the same area. So here we are in 1941 at Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego. And what's there in front of you? Well, they're building kind of the precursor to B-24s called LB-30s, but they're building them outside. Why are they building them outside? Well, they didn't have enough factory space. But when the government personnel in charge of production and the Ford people came in to look at this, they're like, what are you people crazy? You're working on building airplanes out in the sunshine where they heat up and everything expands, and then overnight everything shrinks back down, and the next day they grow again. The car companies just couldn't believe this because they built cars inside. They didn't do it outside. So now this is 1942. And so here you'll see, this is San Diego again. This is consolidated plant number 2 here, number 1 here. This is Lindbergh Field. Now, Lindbergh Field is still there. If you ever flown in or out of San Diego, it's the same place. You fly in right over the tops of the houses and buildings and land there. And this is San Diego Bay right there. So this is January of 42. So, you know, basically 2 months after Pearl Harbor, that it looks like that. And now in 1944, a little bit different look, but here's plant 1 here with bombers sitting out here. This is Lindbergh, and you'll notice Lindbergh now is just 1 runway, as it is today. So in that period, from January of 42 to August of 44, Consolidated had encroached in there, and they decided to only have a single runway. Now you ask, well, how could they do that? Well, because B-24s have tricycle landing gear with a nose wheel. You can just use a single runway, rather than if it was a tailwheel airplane, you'd still need at least 1 crossway depending on the way the wind is blowing. So quite a bit of change went on there in a couple of ways in that area. Oh, by the way, you know, this later became Convair when Consolidated merged with Vultee Aircraft out of Downey. And some of the original buildings are still there right alongside the 5 freeway. You can see them today. The Navy SPA War, Space and Warfare Center folks are in that building that dates all the way back to 1941. Okay, who recognizes this? That's okay. This is Douglas Aircraft Santa Monica. Doesn't look like much, does it? And oh, by the way, Donald Douglas didn't greenfield this. The big building, which looks like a barn, kind of, because it originally was a movie studio for a few years. The movie company went out of business, and Douglas bought that, and you can see down in the foreground one of his biplanes parked there. But this is where Douglas Aircraft really got the start, alongside a runway called Clover Field. And today, that's Santa Monica Airport, and the road alongside the airport is named Cloverfield Boulevard, 1 word. So move forward into the middle of 1941 now, and here's the Douglas factory in Santa Monica with the runway, Cloverfield runway, there in the foreground. And so you see, now, one thing you'll notice on these factories at this time, pre-war, was the building roofs were sawtoothed because they come up and then down, and in the vertical side would be windows to let natural light in during the day, because they really only assemble planes during the day. But this was very much the way airplane factories and even some car factories were built at the time, with the sawtooth roofs. And you'll see that change as we go forward. Now, right in the middle of the photo, you know, you'll see some buildings with the sawtooth, and then what looks like a hangar, that's domed. Well, okay, wait a minute. This is a little too close to the coast where the Japanese could at least shell. I mean, Santa Monica is right on the water. So what are we going to do about that? Well, let's bring in the Hollywood people that know how to do set decoration, and let's have them disguise the buildings, disguise the factories. So if you look in the foreground, looks like a housing neighborhood, regular residential neighborhood. And there in the back, you see a couple of buildings and a couple of what look like hangars. Well, guess what? The buildings in the background are phonies. They weren't working there. They were working in the foreground where the factory is under the camouflage. Here's another photo of different direction over the top of the factory. Again, looks like a residential neighborhood, but on the middle left of the picture, you see those two big pipes sticking up? Those are heat stacks coming from the furnaces because the factory is all underneath that. It was netting up on poles, and then trees and bushes and phony looking houses and garages and whatnot that from the air just look like a residential neighborhood. Now, down in El Segundo, just on the south side of what's now LAX Airport, with next to Imperial Highway, Douglas owned one factory building there that had originally been part of Jack Northrop's second company that Donald Douglas was a partner in. And in 1939, Jack and Donald had a little disagreement, and Jack left, went 5 miles over to Hawthorne, and started his third company, which today is now Northrop Grumman. So Douglas had received a sizable contract from the Navy to build SBDs, Scout Bomber Douglas was the way the Navy termed them. And you see those in the foreground. In the background is Building 902 being constructed. And while you may think looking at that, oh, it looks like steel girders going up, those are 12 by 12 redwood. They actually built this building, which is a half-mile long, out of redwood. They floated the trees down from North California, where the redwoods are, floated them down to San Pedro, trucked them in there to El Segundo, where they had set up a portable sawmill, and they chopped those trees up into 12 by 12 timbers. And that building is still there today, making the back half of F-18s for the Navy. It's amazing. Largest redwood building anywhere, and kind of the longest building west of the Mississippi or something like that. Half-mile long building, still there. I worked in that building. It's actually amazing to see how they were done, because it was built just to last the duration of the war, not be there in 2025 still making airplanes. Meanwhile, the SBDs you see there in the foreground, they were building those outside while the factory was being built. As soon as the building was done, then it became a regular assembly line inside the building. This is one of my favorite pictures from El Segundo in the wartime, in the Redwood building. These two gals, Rosies if you want to call them that, they're on roller skates. And this happened at airplane factories all over the country. They're carrying probably work orders, shop orders, maybe some blueprints or whatever to take them out to the shop. And at least in that building, that was the quickest, easiest way to get around, was just being on roller skates. I wish I'd been able to do that when I was in that building. But I still think that's a cool photo. So here we are overlooking Douglas, El Segundo, and North American, and Mines Field. Mines Field. Anybody know what Mines Field is today? LAX, that's right. This is a long time before then. So, talking about camouflage, here's the Northrop facility right here under camouflage, and it doesn't look like a factory building at all. It just looks like, from the air, just like the rest of the ground around it. This building here, this is North American at the time, where they were starting to build B-25s and P-51s, the early P-51s. And this is Mines Field, which has several runways, including a couple of cross ones at the time. So this side of Imperial Highway is Inglewood. This side is El Segundo.
Looks like the roads are elevated there. Is that camouflage roads also?
No, they didn't camouflage roads. I think that's just the way it came out in the picture. So here we have the Douglas factory that was greenfielded in Orchard Park, Illinois. Now, what is Orchard Park today? Anybody know? What's the airport designator for Chicago O'Hare Airport? ORD, which comes from Orchard Park. Not from Chicago, not from O'Hare. It comes from Orchard Park. This was greenfielded for Douglas to build C-54s. And so if you look at that, you see, of course, up in the top of the photo, the runways, which eventually got reworked, who knows how many times, to make it look like the O'Hare that we know and hate today if you ever fly through there. But on the left-hand side of the picture, it's hard to tell because this is a crummy picture, but on the left-hand side was the factory, and then on the right-hand side, where you can see some little airplane outlines, that's where the modification center was for C-54s, and we'll talk about modification centers in a little bit. Okay, Oklahoma City. Anybody been to Oklahoma City? Oh, come on, it's a big place. This was at the time called the Midway City Air Depot. GOCO, built by the government and operated by Douglas. They built 5,354 C-47s there. They also made parts for C-54s that would go up to Orchard Park, and did some A-26s, which was a Douglas airplane. The long building here, which I know it just looks like a white stripe, but this is an aircraft building hangar. It's a mile long. It was built by the same contractor, same plans as Plant 4 in Fort Worth that we'll show next. This is now Tinker Air Force Base, Oklahoma City Air Logistics Center for the Air Force. This is building 3001 is what everybody refers to it as. Still in business, still got a lot of people inside it and a lot of airplanes. Today they overhaul C-135s and E-6s and AWACS, E-3 AWACS, and a number of other things. But this was, again, greenfielded at the time to be an air depot out in the middle of the heartland. You can't get much more middle than Oklahoma. And I have relatives there, so I can say that. Okay, so this is Plant 4 as it was originally built in Fort Worth to build B-24s by Consolidated. Same building as 3001, a mile long, and designed to run airplanes down through the middle of it. Built by the same contractor, same plan, same time, both in Oklahoma City and Fort Worth. This is a nice color photo of the backyard there in the middle of the production, where you've got some B-24s that are done and pushed out in the backyard so they can be test flown and accepted by the Army. Okay, anybody recognize this? This is Boeing up in Seattle, but wait. Okay, here's some factory buildings, but what's with this neighborhood right by it? Well, That's the camouflage. The factory is right under that camouflage. You just can't see it because of that. Now, what's interesting here was they actually allowed workers from the factory to go up there on top and sun themselves, be out in the fresh air and things like that. They had walkways across it that you could be on. Of course, you couldn't walk on the netting, but you could certainly be on the walkways. So right here, here's a security guard walking along the sidewalk. Now, if you look at the house there on the left-hand side, you see it's kind of short. Well, this is forced perspective, which means that from the air, it would look like a full-size house. When you walk up next to it, yeah, it's only like this tall. But that technique was used at Disneyland to make the castle. When you look at the castle, if you could take a yardstick to it, you would find as you move up, a foot becomes 11 inches, and then it becomes 10 inches, and then it becomes 9 inches. So the building really isn't as tall as it looks to you standing on the ground. This was the same Hollywood technique being used here. All right, this is Lockheed Burbank. A lot of planes built there. You know, now the factory is up in Palmdale. But again, you can see here the sawtooth roof across all those buildings. And they built a lot of P-38 twin-engine fighters. Here, the runway is right down there in the bottom. Today, that area is a shopping center. And when you see the sign from the freeway of the shopping center, one sign has like a constellation outline above it. One has an SR-71. That's where this factory was before they got so closed in by housing and such that they moved to Palmdale. All right, here's a shot of early on at North American Inglewood on the north side of Imperial Highway. Mines Field is in the background. So these are early B-25s being fitted out in what we all call the Sunshine Factory, or outdoors. Airplane's been built, but they're doing final things to them. They even did some painting of stuff outside like that. But if you look around, there's in the background, there's a couple of P-51s back there and other things. They never did put North American under a canopy for some reason. But they were there the whole time building these, as well as B-25s were built in Kansas City that we'll show. And so here's North American Kansas City, greenfielded along the Missouri River. And now here's the interesting thing. This is the Mississippi River winding along back here. And if you notice, it doesn't have any big sides to it. It doesn't have concrete sides or culverts or anything like that. It's just wandering through the farmland. Here's the runways. The main factory is there. And then this is the modification center that was used for getting them ready to go to either Europe or the Pacific, because they used different equipment for each theater of war. Most all of the Navy planes that became PBJs, of which we have one here over in the hangar, were built here in Kansas City. When they came out the back, the Navy took them and pulled them over here into this one little hangar that says U.S. Navy on it, and they changed out the radios, gave it a Navy tail number and a few other things like that, and then they were flown off to the Navy and the Marine Corps. But again, greenfielded, and the Missouri River here came into play a lot. Here's some Rosies out on the ramp there at Kansas City. Notice they're all wearing rubber boots. It's because the Missouri River overflowed the banks and came right across the ramp, and work had to continue, so these poor gals are out there moving around in 2 or 3 inches of water on the ramp while they're finishing things on the airplane. Expedient of war, but that happened quite a bit, that the Missouri would overflow and come right across the ramp. All right, this is a shot of the factory that was built in Marietta, Georgia, which is kind of today a burb of Atlanta. This is just a few miles north of what's now Atlanta Hartsfield Jackson or whatever airport there, the big airport in Atlanta that you may have flown in or out of. So this was stood up as a GOCO for Bell Aircraft to build B-29s. And then following the war, it kind of closed down, and then it was stood up again for the Korean War. And then later, Lockheed came in there, and they've built C-141, C-5s, and a whole lot of C-130s that they're still building. So C-130s are built in this factory there. The runways and such now are part of Dobbins Air Force Base, and so Lockheed, when they're test flying or whatever, uses the Air Force runways. So it's a joint thing, still GOCO, where the factory is owned by the government, but Lockheed is in there operating it. Okay, let's talk about B-29s for a minute. Did you guys know that Dodge, a division of Chrysler, made engines for the B-29s? Well, they did. This is another GOCO on the south side of Chicago. This was stood up to build the engines for B-29s specifically. And Chrysler and Dodge division took this on. They ultimately built 5 engines for each B-29 that was built. And now if you look over here in this quadrant, you see these white things standing up here? Those were the engine test cells. Every R3350, 3,350 cubic inch engines, after they were assembled, was taken to these test cells and run. After it was run, they took it back inside, took it apart, made sure everything was okay or not, fixed it, put it back together, took it back to the test cells, and ran it again. So every engine was run twice at the factory before getting all packaged up and sent to the airplane factory. Today, this area right here, where the test cells are, still exists. It's part of a mall. It's also the Tootsie Roll factory. So enjoy your Tootsie Rolls. That's where they come from, is an airplane engine factory. Here's another great photo. By now, they've graduated there at the Dodge factory to the gals running around on Cushman scooters instead of roller skates, because that was a big factory. And I'm pretty certain, because of them standing in front of a time clock and the slots to put all your time cards in, these gals are probably part of the timekeeping department. And they would have to run around on those scooters to gather up time cards probably every day for the payroll department to work, because it was all just manual time cards. There was no electronic timekeeping in those days. So here's one of our Rosies working on a 3350. And just so you know, elsewhere in Chicago, besides that Dodge plant on the south side, Studebaker was making parts for the B-17 engines. Buick had a 125-acre factory where they made nearly 75,000 engines for B-24s. And oh, by the way, if you take a docent tour, ask them to show you the nameplate on the engine on our Zero. It was built by Buick in that factory, and it's still flying today. Baxter and Abbott Laboratories you can recognize as a medication drug manufacturer. They were making penicillin there. Galvin, which was the precursor to Motorola, which is probably all you know Motorola. Hallicrafters, another radio electronics company, they were there in Chicago. In the Forest Park suburb of Chicago, there was about 10,000 people working, putting together torpedoes for the Navy. So here you are out in the middle of the country putting torpedoes for the Navy together. A couple of steel mills there, but the Dodge factory was 6.3 million square feet. It was huge. They had everything inside there from smelting to forging to building the engines. Those 3350s had about 6,000 parts in each engine. And then they'd get, after Rosie was done there, they'd get put, packaged up, crated, and then put on rail cars and railroaded down to Boeing or Bell or Martin for the final assembly on the B-29s. This is a picture of housing for the Dodge workers that was built at the time. You could buy that house for $6,000 back then. Amazing. Of course, you were making about 60 cents an hour working at the factory, so probably the same kind of ratio as today. But a number of housing developments like that sprang up near the factory so people could be close. And then out on the north side of town, where Orchard Park is today, Park Ridge homes were built to house the officers that were training to fly C-54s from Orchard Park on over to either Britain or Europe onto the continent or to the Pacific. So lots of housing went on there in the Chicago area that still exists today. Okay, here's one of the most famous pictures of a World War II airplane factory. This is Ford Willow Run, of course, from the air, and one of the largest buildings at the time, a whole lot under one roof. You'll notice it's not sawtooth, it's all flat roof. It was all interior lighting and air conditioned 24 hours a day. The one thing that was, doesn't make too much sense to us today is the planes moved in this direction as they were being assembled, but when they got to this point, there was a turntable they moved them onto and turned the planes 90 degrees to continue and come out over here. You say, well, why'd they do that? Well, because Henry, being an old miser, knew that right here was the dividing line from this county and that county, and he didn't want to pay taxes to that county because they were higher. So he actually turned the factory like that so that when the airplanes came out, they were still in the same county as over here. And then needless to say, several runways for flying the planes. But that was just one of the eccentricities of Ford having built the place as a co-go rather than government-owned building it. Part of that is still there. The Yankee Air Museum is in part of there. After the war, GM built different things there like Corvairs. If you're old enough to have ever owned a Corvair, that's where it was built. So this is inside that building, and what you're looking at are the center wing boxes for B-24s up on its side. If you look left and right there, you can see the round openings. That's for the wheels, the main gear wheels, to come up in those wells. The one thing that Ford did, being, a mass producing car company was they made automatic fixturing to build those. So as you go down the line, each of those center wing boxes is pretty close to being a rubber stamp of each of them because it was all automated as far as centering and drilling holes. But here's the thing. Before they started building airplanes, Ford's contract was to make parts, to make kits of parts to send to the other factories like Consolidated out here, Consolidated Fort Worth, even North American down in Texas that built some B-24s. Okay, so how are we going to get those there? Well, wait, we're Ford. We make trucks, don't we? Yeah, okay. So we'll make a special truck to haul those B-24 parts across the country. So they came up with this, what seems now kind of a crazy plan to build these special trucks. Because at the time, we didn't have Freightliners, Peterbilts, and Kenworths that we do now with 13-liter diesels in them with all kinds of power and whatnot. Engines weren't so powerful then. So they decided, well, let's build our own truck. We'll give it 2 engines side by side. And so if you look there up on the dashboard, you'll see 2 ignition keys, one for each engine, as well as gauges and whatnot for both engines. Underneath, this is what it looked like. 2 engines side by side, 2 transmissions, and then from the transmission, they went back to a differential arrangement that then combined the 2 of them to drive the axles. So kind of crazy, but that's what they needed at the time. So here's truck and trailer that they were using for hauling the airplane parts. The engines in those trucks, which were built by 3 different, actually subcontracted to 3 different companies for Ford. They used 239 cubic inch engines that made like 100 horsepower. They then would pull these, what they called super trailers, and they go to Wichita, Fort Worth, and to San Diego. The lot of them, there was about 100 of those. Between them, they made 3,800 trips hauling those kits out to the factories, the airplane factories. And now remember, there was no interstate highway system then. It was mostly 2-lane road, maybe some Lincoln Highway, maybe a little bit of Route 66, but that would have been slow going. Now, oh, by the way, you can look here from the top, and on the left side there in the trailer is actually a center wing box, and then there's a couple of outer wing panels and some other things in there. Those trailers are 60 feet long. Today, an interstate trailer has a maximum length of 53 feet. So these were no doubt long trailers at the time, but specially built to be able to carry those parts as knockdown kits. And this is what got trucked to all those factories. The different pieces, you can see the center wing box right there in the middle of the picture, elevated above, the outer wing panels, and of course the nose and the midsection and the tail. All of that would fit, taken apart, fit into those super trailers. So here's some guys kind of overlooking or looking over one of these rigs. Maybe they wanted to buy it, but right now, there are 2 of those trucks that have been restored. And if you want to buy them, you have to buy both. And the asking price is $1.5 million for them. And you can own a piece of history like that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about data. You see here, when we were doing brand new factories, greenfielding, so going from grass to the first acceptable airplane coming off the line was about 18 months, not very fast. And then from the first airplane off of the line until you hit the full production quantity that the government was looking for was 31 months. Some of the fighter plants, this would be like North American down in Texas, they managed to do it in 24 months. The long one, though, was B-29, 40 months from green grass until full production. B-29s took a while because of the technology that was needed. You know, one of the first problems being a pressurized airplane was when they got up to altitude, the windows would pop out, and they had to figure out how to keep the windows in the airplane. Besides just building the factory itself, you know, getting an assembly line stood up, the supply system stood up, you had to find and hire and train folks to work in it. And sometimes that was as big a problem as anything, was just getting enough trained workers, because you were taking people in that had no mechanical experience whatsoever and train them to work on airplane parts. This graph shows for a lot of different airplanes this whole time, and now the measurement that the Air Corps, Army Air Forces used was looking at the fifth airplane being accepted, so not even the first one off the line, the fifth airplane that was bought off and ready to fly away, and then the 1,000th airplane. Here's B-17 right at the top. If you're a student of history, you know, first flight was back in 1937, and then the Army crashed the airplane and they had to start all over again. But it wasn't until the middle of 1942 that they hit the fifth acceptable airplane, and then the 1,000th one came along pretty quick. Here's B-29 down here, first flight 1943, and then finally middle of 1944, so when they hit stride between all the factories and got out to the 1,000th airplane. Ones that you're familiar with, here's B-24 in this bar right here, B-25, C-47, P-51 Mustang was pretty quick. Middle of 1941 and full 1,000 airplanes in like January of 1943. Pretty quick time there. C-46, which we have sitting right here to your left, first airplane back in 1942, and they didn't hit the 1,000th airplane until the middle of 1944. And they tried a lot of different things with C-46s. You may not know it, but the Higgins Boat Company down in Louisiana that made the biggest majority of landing craft for us, the Navy folks just called them all Higgins boats, whether it was built by Higgins or not. Everybody called them Higgins boats. The Air Corps gave them a contract to build C-46s. So you've got a wood ship company, boat company, trying to make airplanes. They managed to get 2 of them done, and the government said, okay, enough of that. That really didn't work. So this graph is showing these time spans for aircraft, for engines, engine factories, pretty close to the same, from green grass to first engine being accepted, 14 months average, full production 23 months average. But it was really about the same time to convert a building to mass production versus greenfielding. And part of that is because for engines, they needed really special purpose tools. So you had to source those tools, get them ordered, get them made, get them to your factory, and you really couldn't, start building your engines until you had all those tools. So in some ways, either converting a factory or greenfielding took about just about the same amount of time. So kind of a paradox, but yet explained because of mainly the equipment you need to build engines. All right, let's talk about the changes in airplanes. You've got different model number, model letter airplanes, B-17D, E, F, G. Our bomber that we have out here is a J, and there was A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H before J, no I, because you could mistake it for a 1. But here in this picture, here's the noses of 3 different B-24s through the progress of the airplane. The nose on the left is one of the early models that just had the glass nose up front from the bombardier. The one in the background now has machine guns sticking out of the nose. That was one of the early lessons. Hey, we're getting shot at head on, so we need to be able to shoot back. And then the one on the right, number 47 there, has an electric operated turret that could swivel back and forth, up and down. But how are we going to manage all of that? How can we keep the factories running at full production with all these changes going on? Well, that's when modification centers came in. The difference between one model with no turret and the one that turret, that was a pretty serious change. But to begin with, they were doing those at the modification centers. They'd actually have to rework the nose because the plane with the turret there on the right, number 47, actually is longer than either of the other two. So they had to do sheet metal work and convert the bombardier to looking out the bottom down there. There's a piece of optical glass down there in the bottom for the bombardier to use. The other thing that came along as part of that was blocks. So they would assign a certain number of airplanes to be in a block of airplanes that were all supposed to be pretty close the same. And then when they would do something like, say, go to that turret, they'd assign a new block number to it. And that system is still in use today on all of our airplanes. Rob here probably flew a Block 10 or 20 F-16, and now I think they're up to 70 or something like that. So still F-16C model, but a whole bunch of other block changes. Through the life of the B-17, from the beginning of the war until the end of the war, there was 56 different blocks assigned on B-17s because of minor changes, not huge changes, but minor ones. But even the B-17G model, which was the final one that saw service, had 48 blocks to it. So I have written here, as a logistics guy, this kind of stuff gives me nightmares. How do you keep track of all this stuff? How do you keep the technical data, information, and parts lists and whatnot for all the mechanics to use? How do you keep that up to date and get that out to the field forces to be able to maintain the airplanes? I mean, that was tough. This is another example. Now you'll notice both shots are the same tail number airplane, but the tail gunner position is vastly different. This is one of the more well-known ones. This modification was done by United Airlines in Cheyenne, Wyoming. They had a pretty good sized overhaul facility up there, and they took on this work. On the left-hand side, the factory turret on the early models. The poor gunner sitting back there had to look out at a little stick with a bead on the end of it like he was shooting a rifle. On the right-hand side, his position is bigger. He has more window to look out of, and he has a reflector gun sight, just like the fighter airplanes had. So a big change being done at that mod center at Cheyenne, and they continued that for a while until the change could get cut in on the factory lines. And now remember, you had three factories. You had Boeing, you had Lockheed Vega, and then Douglas, all making B-17s. So finally, it got cut in on the assembly line. Here's some Rosies working on the tail guns on B-17Gs at Douglas under the canopy. They're outside, but under the canopy. Now these gals are putting what they call cheek guns, C-H-E-E-K. These were machine guns up in the nose for the navigator and bombardier to use. Those didn't get put in on the assembly line. Those got put in at the mod center. So besides things like that, special equipment for going to the desert, going to the Pacific, going to a northern area, those pieces of equipment were changed out and installed at the modification centers. This is what that nose turret looks like on the final model of the B-24s. Now you notice it's a nice modern color picture. This guy sitting in there actually owns that turret and he displays it, but you can see how a guy had to climb into that thing and sit there sticking out on the nose to fire an incoming aircraft. So, aircraft, engines, and propellers. You need all three. But the final analysis says that with the exception of Ford, all the other main aircraft were built by firms that were in business building aircraft before World War II. And it's important to remember that Ford's Willow Run B-24 factory was greenfielded as an airplane factory, not a car factory being converted. Now, as far as engines, you had two main engine companies, Wright and Pratt & Whitney, and they both did a lot of licensing to other firms. You know, we showed the picture of the Dodge factory building B-29 engines, and of course, Buick in the Chicago area built the engine in R0. Propellers, there was three propeller companies predominantly: Curtiss Electric, Hamilton Standard, and Aero Products. And Aero Products was a newcomer. They were just founded in 1940, but they did things a little bit different. Curtiss did expand, but they tried to keep using their own management, just spreading their own management across a little thinner, and did okay. Ham Standard understood the difficulties of knowledgeable management, but they did subcontract work and managed to hire smart people to supervise that work, and it worked okay. So both kinds of things worked, but in a little bit different ways. Final analysis, they were all successful. So here we are. When you look at the difference between the main two Axis players of Germany and Japan, Roosevelt's strategy is what won the war for the United States. A logistic strategy, rather than, for instance, Hitler and his Blitzkrieg strategy. You know, Hitler expected to win everything quickly. When he went into Poland in September of 1939, a couple of weeks, the war was over. So he thought that's how everything would go. Well, that's how it went until the United States got involved, and when we invaded the continent at Normandy and started bringing in unbelievable amounts of equipment and soldiers, the difference began to show. Germany had more men in its army than we did, and spent more of its gross national product than we did. They had a higher percentage of women working in industry that we did, but we just flat drowned them in equipment and munitions to overcome them. When you look at what came through Normandy, the Normandy beachhead right after the invasion, it's absolutely amazing how much material we were bringing over from the United Kingdom. And the Wehrmacht generals just could not believe how much equipment we were bringing along with us. There's whole articles and books just about that fact. So that brings us to the most fun section, questions and answers. And we have a question already.
Yes, thanks for a great presentation. Could you say some words on the battle in the North Atlantic? Because we had to build it, but then we had to get it there. And the logistics was a monumental task.
Okay, the Battle of the North Atlantic. Battle of the North Atlantic mainly was overcome because we were just building so many ships. Oops, sorry. Let me try not to talk so loud. This is where the production of Liberty ships and the later Victory ships came into play, being built on the West Coast and the East Coast. And we kind of covered that in part one of this on how all of those were built. But it was also, if you ever watched the movie Greyhound on, I think it's Apple streaming service with Tom Hanks, you see when we finally got the destroyers in there shadowing the convoys was when we finally overcame all the German U-boat activity. But again, that was industrial capacity of building Victory ships like they were cars. Victory ships started out, of course, slow being built, but as the people got better at their jobs, which a lot of women building those ships, especially doing welding, because those ships were all welded. They were not riveted together. Our capacity to build those things just overcame getting across the Atlantic.
I guess basically it's more of a comment on what happened then pre-war versus what's happening now. We have an industrial base in China, which is very organized, and they're manufacturing both container ships and naval ships in the same yards. And I'm getting a sense that the U.S. is beginning to kind of sense that and beginning to build up with all these individual small firms that are gearing up, like Anduril and other companies like that are trying to fulfill our need for a military buildup, because who knows what's going to happen in the future. It's a comment.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And one of the issues going on there is that our manufacturing base of, if you go across everything, not just aircraft, but other material you would need to fight a war, that of course has shrunk. And, overall, because we quit buying stuff. Once Vietnam was over, we quit buying so many things, airplanes, guns, bullets, everything like that. And in some ways, where I talked about 1937, 38, 39, where particularly car companies, but absolutely every kind of business out there was very reticent to try to expand, because they would have went out of business because they wouldn't, you make 100 cars and only sell 2 or 3, you're not in business very long. And we kind of have some of that situation now. When you look, there's no more Chance Vought building airplanes. Goodyear's not building airplanes. We have Lockheed, Boeing, and Northrop. Northrop's pretty much the flying wing builder with between B-2 and B-21. Lockheed's been building a lot of fighters, but only when they have a contract in hand. They're not just building stuff to put on the used car lot or something. There is research and development going on even among the big companies, because like you're mentioning, Anduril, that's kind of good news because it's a new small company.
Putting their own money into.
Yeah, and they've got some capital behind that to put in where the big companies also have R&D budgets, and part of the issue there is the ability for a company to budget and spend R&D funds and be able to get that compensated back in contracts kind of keeps wavering back and forth where they can either afford to do it or get compensated for it. When you go back to the 1950s and look at all the Century series of fighters that we did, one after another, every one of them with some technological leaps, and yet, we're flying F-16s, F-16s, F-18s that were designed in the 70s, early 70s, started flying in the late 70s. And yeah, the Super Hornet, the F-18E, F, and G, is not really the same Hornet as the earlier ones, but not such a huge leap. It's just a bigger airframe, but most of the technology has been coming along with it. So your point is well taken. It is a fear, I think, for all of us to make sure that we have enough capacity to at least get started if there was an engagement that we got involved in.
Yeah, maybe you could touch on that. I know as the general public, when they see the government bailing out auto manufacturers, is that to kind of keep that in your back pocket, all of these pipelines, these large factories to build things? Would that be a reason to keep the auto manufacturers alive?
Well, in my opinion only, I think keeping the car companies alive was because of everything it takes to build cars. You got people, you need people employed, and then all of the material, raw material, and then parts it takes to build cars. So there's that whole infrastructure coming down from the top of the car assembly line that you want to keep in business, just from an economic standpoint. Because if you were to lose them and have huge unemployment, shutter a factory, when you think of all the small businesses and people and even the towns where those businesses are that would suffer when a supply chain just comes to an abrupt end. It's more that as opposed to keeping the airplane factories going. And one could argue when you look at the planes we're flying right now, oh yeah, the government gave that contract to Boeing to build T-7 Red Hawks because they were going to give the B-21 contract to Northrop, even though Northrop was going to propose a trainer in competition against Boeing. So whether or not that's really happening would be hard to prove, but certainly you want to keep the industrial base, what we refer to as warm, where they're actually making stuff, maybe not a high rate, not mass production, but making stuff, because to go from a warm factory that's maybe making 10 things a month to get them up to 100, to get them up to 1,000 is a whole lot less of a problem than greenfielding a factory and having to build it and then trying to staff it and make things. So kind of different parts of the same kind of issue, though. You want those businesses to stay warm. And that was one of the things when I was working with the services, was this issue of trying to keep factory lines warm. You know, maybe we're not being contracted to build brand new stuff, but send us your broken stuff to fix, because it keeps our people employed, keeps their skills fresh, and we're using parts that we're buying from small companies across the country. And as long as we're keeping warm, if we need to jump up to mass production, it's doable. You know, that answer you?
Is there a figure on how many aircraft were deployed on D-Day?
Yes. The short answer is yes. Do I know that number? No. It actually, to get an exact number would be difficult, because you had the preliminary bombing being done overnight, you know, trying to soften up the beach defenses, which they kind of missed. All the bombs accidentally got dropped too far inland and missed all the gun emplacements right there on the beaches. So that didn't work real well. Getting the paratroopers in at midnight on June 6th was another whole thing. You know, some of them got shot down by anti-aircraft. Some of them landed in fields that had been flooded, and our guys drowned. All kinds of issues there. Luckily, my uncle, who was 82nd Airborne, made it okay and walked all the way into Berlin. But the exact number being used on D-Day, probably nobody really knows that, because you know, once the invasion had started, we had fighters and photo planes overflying the beaches, because remember, there was only like 2 or 3 Germans that even dared to come to the beach, because they were going to get shot down. So great question. Have to research that.
Can we hear it for John?
Well, thanks to Rob for putting this thing together. You have some final words?
Thanks for being here. Enjoy the rest of the museum.
Man, a few words.